Welcome back. Last time I talked about the Roman conquest of Gaul, but I want to pause in the chronological narrative here to talk about a very important subject about which too little is known, namely religion and the Celts, and particularly the role of Druids in Celtic society. I'll look at the general beliefs of the Celtic peoples insofar as we can get at them, and then we'll talk about Druids in some detail, because, let's face it, Druids are cool. But our task in this lecture will be difficult, and much of what I will say will be frustratingly general and tentative. Part of the problem with reconstructing pagan religion, as we've pointed out in talking about the ancient Celts in general, is the fact that we have two kinds of texts about the topic that we might use, but each of these kinds of texts has a major drawback. The first kind of text is a kind we're already familiar with, namely reports about the Celts by their neighbors in the classical world, the Romans and Greeks. These sources have all the same advantages and disadvantages with regard to learning about Celtic religion that they do when we're looking at any other aspect of the Celtic world. We can't be sure how well these writers really understood what they wrote about. But in many cases, these texts are all we have, so we need to make the best of them. The other kind of text we have is at least written by people we think of now as Celts, especially the Irish. But there are two problems with these texts. The first is that they were all written down after the Irish converted to Christianity, so you have people looking back on beliefs that they no longer hold, and customs that they no longer practice, or at least that they're not supposed to be practicing. So it's hard to know if they are remembering accurately, or in fact, if they are deliberately distorting the historical record because their new status as Christians makes them uncomfortable with that record. The second problem is that we're not entirely sure, as we've already said, and will say again, how much of a connection there is between the people of Ireland, say, and the people of Gaul. Do we have any right even to expect that their beliefs would be the same? That is a question we will need to leave somewhat open. But there are at least some intriguing parallels that could make us inclined to accept a connection between different areas of the Celtic-speaking world, after all. Now, one reason to look at Celtic religion is precisely because this topic should help us answer the question of whether we can see anything distinctive that unites the so-called Celtic peoples across space and time. But in fact, the evidence for diversity of beliefs is just as compelling as the evidence for unity. Celtic mythology is hard to reconstruct, but it seems to have focused on a pantheon of nature-related gods, and also belief in an other world that was located either across the sea or under the ground. That seems to be a bottom line that we observe across all Celtic-speaking territories. But when we start to get specific, the picture is murkier. If we were to plot a map with mentions of the various deities that the Celts worshipped, there would be some common cults that appear over wide stretches of territory. But there are also many, many gods that were highly localized. It is hard, if not impossible, to reconstruct anything like a Celtic pantheon that stretches across all the Celtic lands. But we have to be brave and proceed. So let's start with what the classical world thought about what the ancient Celts believed. One of the aspects of Celtic belief that struck the classical authors the most forcefully was their fixation with treasure, especially gold, which was often offered as a sacrifice to their gods. We have several reports of how the Gauls would deposit large amounts of gold and silver in their temples, and Strabo reports in amazement that the treasure would be absolutely safe. Nobody would think of touching it. But according to Posidonius, besides offering treasure as a sacrifice in temples, the Gauls would deposit gold and silver in lakes. We know that the Celts believed in an otherworld, for which water was a kind of boundary. So by depositing the treasure in lakes, they were essentially sending it to the realm of the gods. And by the way, this habit of depositing valuable objects in water continued for hundreds, even thousands of years after the period of Celtic dominance in Gaul. French peasants were still depositing precious objects in water in the medieval period. So you have all these Gauls throwing gold and silver into lakes, and this becomes known to the Romans. What are the very pragmatic Romans going to do about it? Strabo tells us that whenever a Gaulish region was conquered, the Roman authorities would auction off these lakes to raise money for the public treasury. Presumably, the buyers of the lakes would then drain them. It helps that the Romans are excellent engineers, and then scoop up all the treasure at the bottom. We have evidence that the Celts had some kind of mystical connection to birds. A historian from the late 3rd century BC named Eudoxus reported that if the plagues of locusts descended on the crops of the Celts would use special prayers and offer special sacrifices to attract flocks of birds who would come and eat the locusts. And this sounds like a kind of early organic pest control. Birds are a common element in reports about Celtic beliefs, but they didn't always play the same role. There's a report from a late 2nd century BC writer named Artemidorus of Ephesus, who traveled all the way to the western Mediterranean, that a later writer named Strabo included in his geography, though Strabo wasn't sure it was true. Apparently, in some port town on the Atlantic coast of Europe, there were 2 crows with whitish right wings, and these crows were used to settle disputes. 2 men who had a dispute would come to the crows, put a plank on an elevated place, and then each man would throw cakes of barley into the air. The birds would eat some of the cakes, but they would scatter others. The man whose cakes the birds scattered would win the dispute. Now, Strabo doesn't find this plausible, but we should remember that the classical world was full of cults in which omens that were just as strange were used to predict the future. In their use of birds for divination purposes, the Celts were firmly in the mainstream. There are also signs that the Celts attached some kind of religious or at least symbolic significance to the severed human head. Livy records a story about what happened to the Roman general Postumius when he was killed while fighting against the Boii tribe of Cisalpine Gaul in northern Italy. According to Livy, the Gauls took his severed head in a procession to their chief temple, and once the skull had been cleaned, they ornamented it with gold and used it thereafter as a drinking cup for their priests on special occasions. Now here is a case where we do need to be somewhat careful with our sources, since Livy was writing 2 centuries later, and we also have reports of other ancient peoples using people's skulls as drinking cups. This could be a case of literary borrowing. Livy has read this story somewhere, and he thinks it'll give his account of the Gauls that extra exotic touch. Or it could actually be a case where the idea of using a human skull as a drinking cup either spontaneously occurred to different people, or the idea may have spread from one people to another. We certainly know from the many representations of the human head on various artifacts that the cult of the head was widespread, so prominent, in fact, that after the Romans had conquered Gaul, they felt called upon to ban the display of severed heads. It was just too much for the Romans. Though apparently, gladiatorial contests fought to the death and executing criminals by means of wild beasts was okay. One of the Celtic beliefs that caused the most comment among ancient writers was the belief in reincarnation, which was, incidentally, a belief that the famous Greek philosopher Pythagoras shared. Diodorus reports that the Gauls believed that a few years after death, a departed person would be reborn into a new body. He states that some Gauls would throw letters into a funeral pyre so that they could be read by people who had already died. So far, we have assembled a rather eclectic list of things that the Celts believed. They don't really amount to a systematic worldview, probably because we really don't have access to the mythological stories of the ancient Celts, and it's very hard to know how the surviving stories from Britain and Ireland do or do not correspond to stories that would have been current in Gaul, say, in the classical period. we're left with a sense that the Celts had a special reverence for certain aspects of the natural world, and that they did believe in some kind of other world or continuation of human existence after death. So who was in charge of Celtic religion? Of course, the first word that most people think of when they think of Celtic pagan religion is probably Druid. Druids seem to have been a feature of British, Irish, and Gaulish society, but they're not found in every part of Europe where Celtic languages were spoken. Druids were apparently especially popular in Britain. In fact, Julius Caesar reports that the Druid movement began in Britain, and that Gaulish Druids, who really wanted to advance their careers, actually went to Britain to study there. It's interesting that one place where you don't see them at all is Spain. So the area of Celtic speech is not exactly the same as the area where Druids were active. Caesar reports that the Druids were extremely powerful in Gaulish society. In fact, he put the Druids on an equal footing with warriors in the social pecking order in Gaul. The Druids were essentially the intelligentsia. They controlled religious life, but they were also the lawyers and judges of the Gauls. The Druids decided legal disputes, and anyone who refused to abide by their rulings was banned from religious ceremonies and ostracized by everyone. The reward for all this labor was that the Druids were exempt from combat and did not have to pay any war taxes. The high social status of Druids put them at the center of politics in Celtic territories. Druids were often seen as the heart of Celtic resistance to Roman authority. Julius Caesar worried a lot about Druids during his conquest of Gaul, and when the Romans later conquered Britain, one of their top priorities was to destroy the Druid center on the island of Mona, off the northwest coast of Wales. But if the Romans feared Druids, they were also fascinated by them, just as we are. For some very interesting details about Druids, we can turn to the natural history of the Roman author Pliny the Elder, which was written 2 years before Pliny died in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. Pliny reports that the Druids worshipped only in oak groves and would not carry out their ceremonies unless a branch of that tree was present. By the way, this is one reason to be faintly suspicious of the latter-day Druids who like to worship at the summer solstice at Stonehenge. Real Druids would not have been caught dead worshipping at Stonehenge. Only an oak grove would do, at least according to Pliny. Pliny also reports that the Druids were particularly devoted to the mistletoe plant. The Celtic word for mistletoe supposedly meant all-healing. Apparently, the Druids would prepare a drink from mistletoe that was reputed to make barren livestock fertile and to counteract all poisons. Pliny reports these beliefs, but he does not share them. He says rather dismissively, "Such is the devotion to frivolous affairs shown by many peoples." So how did one get to be a Druid? It was a little like getting to Carnegie Hall. You needed to practice. Druids trained for many years to master very complex texts by memory, since they did not believe in writing down sacred things. Instead, they would spend many years memorizing every aspect of Druid lore. It could take as long as 20 years to become a fully trained Druid. As I've said, they wanted to keep their minds sharp by exercising their memories, and they doubtless also wanted to keep arcane knowledge to themselves. But what were they keeping secret? If we knew that, we'd really be somewhere, wouldn't we? But one thing we can be fairly sure of is that the Druids had a belief in fate, or at least in luck, in the sense that some times were lucky while others were unlucky. In an earlier lecture, I talked about how the Coligny calendar, which was made in the 2nd century AD, makes it clear to us that the Gaulish language was alive and well at that time. But the Coligny calendar also seems to provide confirmation that Druids were in charge of determining which days were auspicious for engaging in certain activities. For example, Posidonius tells us that the Druids were often in charge of deciding whether it was a good day to give battle. He tells us that it was by no means unheard of for two armies to be drawn up, ready to fight each other, when all of a sudden the Druids would step between them and stop the battle from taking place. Posidonius seems rather surprised at the authority the Druids have over their people, which might say something about his experience with the priests of his own culture. I mentioned earlier that one of our challenges in dealing with Celtic religion is the fact that our sources don't match. We have classical sources from the early period and Celtic sources from the later period, and we always have to wonder whether we can really draw a straight line between the world of the classical Celts and the Irish and British culture that is often associated with it. But we do have hints in Irish literature that Druids were important in Ireland, and that there, too, the Druids had the job of deciding what was lucky and what was not. There's a wonderful example of a Druid ruling on this question of what a day was lucky for in a famous Irish story called The Toyne, or the Cattle Raid of Cooley, which takes place in the north of Ireland. I'll talk much more about this text in a later lecture. Towards the beginning of the story, we get a kind of prologue in which we find out about the birth of a king. Supposedly, the Princess Nessa, the daughter of the King of Ulster, was looking out on the road when a Druid named Cathbad came by. She asked him, "What is today lucky for?" Maybe that was just the polite question you asked a Druid. Cathbad answered, presumably thinking quickly, "For begetting a king on a queen." Since there was no other man nearby, Nessa and Cathbad have a tryst, and 9 months later, the future king Conovar is born. Well, it turned out to be somebody's lucky day, and that somebody was Cathbad the Druid. To return to the classical period for a moment, we have a report recorded by Cicero about an actual Druid. In Cicero's treatise on divination, which he addressed to his brother Quintus, he reports the following. "The practice of divination is not even neglected by barbarians. I know there are Druids in Gaul because I met one myself, Dividiacus of the Edui tribe, who was your guest and praised you highly. He claimed a knowledge of nature derived from what the Greeks called physiologia, the inquiry into natural causes and phenomena. He would predict the future using augury and other forms of interpretation." Notice the charming detail that Cicero passes along the praise offered by this Druid to his brother. The point of Cicero's treatise is that divination is something that everybody does, even barbarians. But the tiny whiff of snobbery is balanced out by the clear implication that Cicero is interacting with this Druid on an even social footing. But Celtic religion appears to have had a darker side as well, which the Romans did not approve of, because the knowledge of the future and of what days were lucky could come at a high cost. We have many early references to the Celts practicing human sacrifice. The earliest, very fragmentary reference to Celtic human sacrifice comes in an odd place. It's in a Greek comic tirade written in the late 4th century BC, in which the author, Sopater, is denouncing 3 fellow writers. He tells his audience what he would like to do to these terrible writers. It's what the Celts do to their enemies after a successful battle. Quote, "Among them is the custom, whenever they are victorious in battle, to sacrifice their prisoners to the gods. So I, like the Celts, have vowed to the divine powers to burn those 3 false dialecticians as an offering." So, the propensity of the Celts to sacrifice their victims was so well known in the ancient world that we find it as a topical reference in satire. So how did human sacrifice actually function in the Celtic belief system? Well, Posidonius tells us that the Gaulish Druids would use human victims to foretell the future. The Druids would stab a man right above his diaphragm, and then, when the man has collapsed from the wound, they interpret the future by observing the nature of his fall, the convulsion of his limbs, and especially from the pattern of his spurting blood. The method with the birds and the barley cakes was rather benign in comparison. Julius Caesar reports that the Druids would build enormous figures in which they would encase their victims and then set them alight. This is, by the way, the story that gave rise to a novel that inspired the 1973 film Wicker Man, in which a Scottish policeman goes to a remote Scottish island to investigate a crime and discovers, to his horror, that the inhabitants have embraced Celtic paganism. This film was later remade in 2006, starring Nicolas Cage. But human sacrifice apparently came in various forms. That is, there were different ways in which the victims might be sacrificed. We might even have direct evidence of one of the alternatives to burning people alive, since many bodies of people who were ritually killed have been recovered from bogs in Celtic territory. The interesting thing about this practice is that it seems to have been widespread across Northern Europe, really anywhere that bogs are found, whether the land was ever inhabited by Celtic speakers or not. These bog bodies have been discovered as far north as Scandinavia, and nobody has ever seriously claimed that there were Celts in Scandinavia. This means that, like a lot of other aspects of life among the Celts, their religious practices, if this really was a religious practice, nobody is totally sure, their religious practices were not exclusive to the Celts. There were many areas in which their customs overlapped with those of their neighbors. Burying people in bogs was apparently just such a great idea that people did it all over Northern Europe. You didn't have to belong to a specific cultural or linguistic grouping to think that throwing a human being who had been ritually killed into a bog was the thing to do. One of the interesting aspects of the Druids is the fact that we have reports that some Druids were women. Probably a small number, but they were not unknown. The classical sources note the presence of women Druids, and they crop up in later Irish literature as well. For example, in Posidonius, there is a report of an island in the Atlantic Ocean at the mouth of the River Loire in Gaul that was inhabited entirely by women who worshipped in the cult of Dionysus. Dionysus is the Greek god of wine. Probably Posidonius is engaging in the well-known classical practice of equating any gods he comes across among foreigners with gods he is familiar with in his own pantheon. Supposedly, these women would come to the mainland once a year to sleep with men, and then they would return to the island. But they would also engage in a bizarre ritual every year by which they would take the roof off of a temple piece by piece and then build it back up again. And if any of the women dropped her load of tiles, the others would tear her to pieces. Posidonius even tells us that the fix is in. A specific woman is bumped by the others to make her drop her load. It's a very puzzling account. It's hard to know what to make of it. But at the very least, it's an indication of the kinds of things that classical writers believed about the Celts. To return for a moment to the question of the Celtic calendar, there are clues in the way that the Celts organized time that they probably believed in some sort of pantheon of gods that was connected to the natural world. There are some intriguing parallels between the Coligny calendar of 2nd century Gaul and the system of reckoning time that we can observe a few centuries later in Ireland. For example, in both Ireland and Gaul, the week was reckoned to be 8 days long, and the day was reckoned to last from sundown to sundown, unlike the Roman system, which reckoned the day from sunrise to sunrise. Given these similarities between the calendar in Ireland and on the continent, we may be entitled to fill in some of the gaps in our continental evidence from what we find later in Ireland, though we should do so very cautiously. The Coligny calendar does not tell us about how the seasons worked in Gaul. But in Ireland, the calendar was organized around the 4 main turning points of the agricultural year. The interesting thing about these turning points is that they are exactly 6 weeks off from the turning points we recognize under our modern calendar, which was of course based on the Roman calendar. Our calendar recognizes the changes of the seasons by noting the 2 solstices and the 2 equinoxes, that is, the days when the day is longest and when it is shortest, and the 2 days when the day and the night are of equal length. In Ireland, by contrast, The 4 turning points of the year occurred at February 1st, about halfway between the winter solstice and the spring equinox, and May 1st, halfway between the spring equinox and the summer solstice, and again at August 1st and November 1st. Each of these festivals was connected in some way to the rhythms of the agricultural year. The feast on February 1st was called Imbolc. It was a lambing festival, and it later became associated with the cult of St. Bridget. I'll talk more about St. Bridget in a later lecture. The May 1st feast was called Beltane, and it corresponded to the date when cattle were driven out to the summer pastures. On August 1st was the feast of Lunasa, which was a harvest festival. The feast was named for the god Lugh, about whom I'll say more shortly. November 1st was the date of the festival of Samhain, which celebrated the return of the cattle from the summer pastures and the slaughtering of animals for the winter. Now, if we remember that the Celtic day started at sundown, we can see that the festival of Samhain actually began on the evening of what would be for us October 31st, that is, Halloween. Our celebration of Halloween is partly based on this Celtic festival, when the fairy folk were supposed to walk abroad. The fairies are regarded by many folklorists as the leftovers of the original Celtic gods. And speaking of gods, I said at the beginning of this lecture that there are some common elements in Celtic religion that cut across the whole area of Celtic speech, but that there's also considerable diversity. One of our difficulties in getting at the Celtic gods is the lack of good evidence. The classical authors are not as helpful here as they might be, because they have this habit I mentioned of just equating any gods they came across among other peoples with gods they recognized themselves. So, for example, Caesar reports that the Gauls worshipped Mercury. I doubt it. But Caesar had probably come across a Gaulish deity who had some of the qualities he associated with Mercury, so he assumed the two gods were the same. We have to be clever in looking for evidence of Celtic cults. In some cases, we can't see Celtic religion until after the advent of Roman rule has brought literacy to the Celtic-speaking regions. One good place to find Celtic gods is on Latin inscriptions on votive tablets. These were records of donations or sacrifices offered to the gods, or requests that the god or goddess punish an enemy of the donor, as we see on the famous curse tablets at Aquae Sulis, modern-day Bath. They're dedicated to the goddess Sulis Minerva, a composite deity with both Celtic and Roman traits. There are even 2 rare curse tablets that seem to have been written in a Celtic language, probably the ancestor of British. You can also find some depictions of gods on sculptures, with or without accompanying inscriptions. Another key place to look is on the map of Europe. I mentioned the god Lugh, for whom the feast of Lunasa is named. The god Lugh is one of the figures who seem to have been important in many places, right across the areas we're looking at in this course. One reason we know this is that place names based on the god Lugh can be found widely scattered across Europe. For example, the city of Lyon in France was once called Lugdunum, which comes from a Gaulish name meaning fortress of the god Lugh. We can piece together a little bit about who Lugh was supposed to be. He seems to have been a god of lightning or of storms in general, though he may also have been associated with war. Much of what we know about him comes from later Irish stories that were written down after the conversion of Ireland to Christianity, but we're probably safe in assuming that the stories are fairly old. We can't tell whether they're derived ultimately from stories that circulated on the European mainland, or whether they arose first in Ireland. Lugh is supposedly skilled in all the arts, from blacksmithing to warfare to poetry. There seem to have been a few other figures who were widely worshipped all across the Celtic territories, such as the great horse goddess Epona, or the fertility goddess Brieg, who, like Lugh, is spread across the map of Europe and whose name is preserved in the name Britain. But there are dozens and dozens of other Celtic deities who seem to have been worshipped in a far more isolated fashion. Thus, Celtic religion leaves us with some intriguing questions. There are strong parallels between the beliefs and practices we see in Britain and Ireland in the historical period, and the beliefs and practices we see in Gaul in the classical period, but there are also aspects of Celtic ritual that varied locally. Some Celts had Druids, others didn't. Some buried sacrificial victims in bogs, others didn't. We probably have here an equivalent of the same dynamic we've seen with regard to material culture. People of Celtic speech did not feel bound to accept a single religious toolkit any more than they felt bound to cooperate with each other politically at all times or to adopt the same style of art. There were general trends that cut across the Celtic world, but no single pattern that everyone followed. In religion, as in much else, the Celts liked to make up their own minds.